Hey everybody, this is Nathan. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to Paul's letter to the Romans, which is we didn't get much chance to talk about this in class on Friday, and I think it's a difficult text. It's dense. It's not hugely long, but it's long enough, and the logic is pretty convoluted. So I want to just give you a little bit of idea of who Paul is, why he's so important, and a little bit about sort of the themes to watch for um, as you as you read this text. Okay. Um, First of all, so who was Paul? Paul was a Pharisee, um, which means that he belonged to the ancient Jewish community. He was that. I mean, we talked about who the Pharisees were. The Pharisees were the sect within Judaism that tended to value law and tradition as opposed to sort of temple sacrifices. And Paul really is proud of his identity as a Pharisee. And in many of his writings, much later in his life, even after he's sort of gone on to reject a lot of what he previously believed in, he still sort of insists, like, not only was I a Pharisee, I was like the best Pharisee ever. I was like totally devoted. I totally believed in this stuff, and I never made any mistakes. I always followed all the laws. I mean, Paul is, he has a high opinion of himself when it comes to this stuff. So he's proud of his commitment and his devotion to the law, and he thinks he was a super Pharisee. He was awesome. And in line with this, he sees the folks who are followers of Jesus and the way that they reverence their dead leader, who was a criminal and who blasphemed against the Jewish authorities, according to Paul. He really didn't like them, and actually, I mean, it seems like this was very genuine. He actually seems to have loathed the early Christians, and he was present at the very first Christian martyrdom when a man got stoned to death. So this is like legitimate. He really didn't like Christians, and he ended up being involved in some of the early persecution, some of the attempts to kind of like get rid of or drive out the Christians from the community of Jews in Jerusalem. And remember, at this point, all of the Christians and anybody who we would call a Christian was Jewish and had been raised Jewish. Right? Remember that. So Paul actually becomes such an effective persecutor of Christians that he's sort of given authority to go and sort of essentially combat the sort of growing influence of Christianity in other places. So he's sent to Damascus, which is now Syria, and when he is traveling, he has this sort of dramatic conversion experience, which is, I mean, if you look at the image that's on the screen right now, that's what this is. I mean, this is a medieval painting of sort of a representation of Paul's experience. So Paul, in his telling of it, he describes this in the book of Acts. In his telling of it, he's traveling on the road. It's the middle of the day. He sees a bright, blinding light, and he's sort of thrown down to the ground. And he hears a voice saying, which it's not stated explicitly, but the assumption is that this is his encounter with the risen Christ, with resurrected Jesus. This is just a fairly short time, a couple of years after Jesus's crucifixion. So he's thrown to the ground. He sees this light, and he hears a voice saying, "Why do you persecute me?" So it says, Saul, which was his Hebrew name, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he experiences this period of blindness. And this is a quotation from the book of Acts. So this is exactly how he puts it in his own words. He says, "We had all fallen to the ground. I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, that is Aramaic, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads.'" And goads here is a reference to the handling of horses. So, kicking against the goads is kind of like kicking against whips, kicking against spurs. It's kicking against things that you really can't get away from. And it's a kind of like, unnecessary, obstreperous, painful resistance. So, God is basically like, okay, give it up. It's time for you to come with me. So Paul, and what happens then is that Paul ends up he's taken to Damascus. Ultimately, another Christian is told in a vision to go find him. He finds him and lays hands on him and cures him of his blindness. And eventually he returns to Jerusalem, where, the community is first very skeptical of him, but then finally they kind of welcome him and recognize that he's he's now one of them, even though he'd been persecuting them for so long. Um, so, Paul has this tremendous conversion experience, and that, I think, is probably one of the most important themes of Paul's work. And so I just want to say a little bit about kind of, what to look for when you read this stuff. So conversion is important. And, think about the word conversion. It literally means, the first part, con, is around, or, well, the word literally means to turn around. So, versio is Latin for turning, um, and there's a Greek equivalent, metanoia, which also means to turn around. So the idea is really that God has like grabbed hold of Paul and has turned him to face the opposite direction from what he was facing before. It's almost this kind of physical image. So Paul was doing one thing one day, and then God sort of seized hold of him and made him essentially do the exact opposite of what he'd been doing up to that point. Let me actually just go back to this for a second. One thing that you can't read all this in the amount of time it's on the screen, but essentially Paul also understands at this point that he has been given the mission of taking the message of Christ beyond the boundaries of the Jewish world and bringing it to the Gentiles. And, again, like I said, up to this point, all Christians were Jews, right? I mean, they had, Jesus was Jewish, all of his followers were Jewish, and although there were non-Jews who sort of heard the message and were reverential, I mean, we see this in Mark, really the Christian community was made up of Jews who had accepted Christ, who sort of, decided to become followers of Jesus. Paul is the person who ultimately will change that definitively. And that's one of the reasons he is so critical in the history of Christianity. And so he converts. Because of his conversion, well, I shouldn't say because, but his conversion sort of sets up this whole series of binaries, these kind of like, this versus that oppositions. And, actually, law versus gospel is probably the most crucial theme that runs through all of Paul's writing. Law he associates with Jewish tradition. The law is sent by God as a way of kind of like restraining us and constricting us and directing our focus to our own sinfulness and to our transgressions and to the rules that we break. And it's inevitably connected with punishment. Whereas gospel, on the other hand, good news, right, it's connected with ideas of being of freedom and being released from these kinds of constraints and for kind of like the opportunity for forgiveness and for a new life. Themes of old and new show up all throughout Paul's work. And I think this goes back to the idea of conversion. I mean, there's with Paul, there's clearly like an old self and a new self. And although there's continuity, I mean, he doesn't forget who he was and he doesn't, deny it. But clearly, the power to change into something new is something that, like only God could do that to him. Paul did not convert or become something new on his own power, right? God seized hold of him and changed him. And now he's transformed. And that sort of idea of transformation is crucial. He's really, another theme that crops up over and over again in Paul is the idea of flesh and spirit. The law focuses on the flesh, it governs our flesh. But when the good news comes, we are not sort of controlled by our own bodies. We're not controlled by our flesh. We're not controlled by our desires. We are able to be free from that, and we live a liberated life in the spirit. And then this one is, I guess I would say this is probably kind of like, this is just me talking. I don't think most people would agree with me about this, but I think if you think back to what we read in the Gospel of Mark and the sort of emphasis on like a very human Jesus, a Jesus who's a man who, he has feelings, he gets angry, he is fearful, he eats and drinks, he's very conscious that his own death is like just over the horizon, right? I mean, Nick Cave talks about that. Paul never talks about any of that stuff. Paul is not interested in Jesus' healing miracles. He's not interested in his teachings even, really. What he's interested in is the fact that Jesus was crucified and died and ultimately was resurrected and came back. And it's this defeat over death that frees us. That's the most important thing about Jesus, is his death and resurrection. So he has this eternal significance that's totally distinct or, even superior to, in a sense, his actual life on earth. So I don't want to say that like Jesus and Christ are like opposed to each other, but it's a real kind of like de-emphasis of the human Jesus and a strong emphasis on the divine Christ. Okay. Finally, I just want to throw this map up on the screen. I mean, I want you to see that, from the perspective of somebody living in Paul's world, Paul's travels covered a huge chunk of the Roman Empire. So, I mean, over here is Jerusalem. Here is Damascus, right? This is where Paul's story starts out. And then over the course of the second half of his life, he travels, all over the Mediterranean. And, it could take months or, sometimes years. And, sea travel was not reliable. These are hard journeys that he took. So he travels, all over Turkey. This is Turkey. This is Greece. Up here is, I guess this is basically Croatia now. Wait, no, sorry. I take that back. I'm wrong. That's all Greece. Up here is Croatia, and then all the way up here on the left is Rome. Sorry, I'm moving the cursor around really weird. But anyway, so I just wanted to see, like, Paul covers so much ground. So he travels around for decades, founds churches, writes letters to those churches. Ultimately, he is captured in Jerusalem, and because he is legally a citizen of Rome, he actually requests a trial in Rome. So he's this like little sort of orangish line here, right in the middle. Sort of that's the route that he took to go back to Rome from Jerusalem at the end of his life. Ultimately, he would be condemned to death in Rome and executed, and that was the end of Paul. And we'll talk about this later.